Hello, my name is Chris Hughes. Thank you for joining another Acquia webinar. Today we'll be discussing strengthening cloud security with SSPM, or SaaS Security Posture Management, which we'll be diving into. Before we dive in, I will do a round of introductions, go around the table here. So Jonathan, you want to go first? Tell us who you are, what you're up to.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. It's always good to be here on another one of these. Hey, everybody, I'm Jonathan Rao. I am the Vice President Distinguished Engineer at Query, a federated search platform for security teams. I am also on the board of Phoenix Security, an ASPM tool, and the maintainer and author of the open source CSPM and SSPM tool, Electric Eye.
How about you, Dave?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Hi, I'm David Gagliata, and I am a security architect on the SaaS governance team here at Acquia.
And last but not least, Alec, you want to hop in there?
Absolutely. Hey, everyone. Pleasure to be here today. My name is Alec Pfeiffer. I'm with AppOmni. Been with the company for about 2.5 years and run a few of our product teams as well as our offensive security research team. So pleasure to be with you guys today and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to chat about this. It's been a pretty hot topic in the industry lately. But before we dive into tool specifics or technology specifics, I'm curious each of your guys, perspective when it comes to cloud security. Why do you think SaaS in particular is kind of forgotten in the conversation? We often kind of discuss cloud security in the context of AWS and Azure and GCP, despite headline after headline of a SaaS provider being breached or having an incident that has a cascading impact on consumers and customers. Why is SaaS kind of the redhead stepchild of cloud security when it comes to the industry? Whoever wants to jump in, feel free.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in real quick. Honestly, I thought about this for a while. I think almost something as simple as the distribution of the shared responsibility model. Like if I'm a security professional at any given company and I look across AWS's shared responsibility model or any responsibility model that's out there, I see one little sliver at the top that's SaaS. And to me, that's just a visual representation of I don't need to worry about that really, because configuration, I know how to do that. It seems very simplistic, but it doesn't actually represent the nature that if you blow out that one square, that one rectangle, there's a tremendous amount of responsibility, a tremendous amount of risk there. So I don't want it to sound overly simplistic, but I think a visual goes a long way. In this case, it kind of hampers folks' understanding and becomes an afterthought because you're going to worry about all the red boxes that are below that. And so infrastructure as a service gets a ton of awareness, but there isn't necessarily that same representation on the SaaS side, especially when we start looking at the amount of data that is stored within a SaaS application compared to a homegrown application run on AWS or Azure infrastructure. But David, Jonathan, what do you guys think?
Yeah, no, I think thank you for calling out the shared responsibility model, because that's something like I actually did a demo of AppOmni and SSPM tools, and I talk a lot about SSPM tools on a day-to-day basis. And it's interesting because as I start going through that, that's one thing that really jumps out. And I think it's kind of often forgot about is that, how SaaS security is actually different than your traditional like cybersecurity principles in a way where everybody's focused on like network infrastructure and the other components where, you have to look and actually define like what is SaaS security. And in that shared responsibility model, no matter what deployment model you're setting up or configuring, you're always going to be responsible for identity. You're always going to be responsible for your data. And that's, taking that step back and actually defining SaaS security and looking at it from that lens is really key. And I think that, again, oftentimes it's sort of forgotten about because everybody's focused on the other components and the pieces that comprise the quote unquote cloud.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, I think it's easy to get lost in that shared responsibility model. AWS doesn't call it SaaS; they call them abstracted services, which is kind of weird, right? Where the CSP tools call them its IaaS tool, something higher up on the stack. But if you looked at that visual when AWS still had it floating around, it was like the customer side of it was only like 3 blocks highlighted. It was like identity encryption, and then your data. And then you look at that, and it's like, well, versus this mountain of other stuff I have to do. Let's say if I'm running, a stack on Kubernetes or a stack on OpenShift or wherever it needs to be, or even if you're not using an orchestrator, you just got a bunch of other things running around. It's kind of easy to bias on the side of where you have more fires to put out than less. And the understanding that early on, we didn't have a lot of support for just like basic run of the mill public cloud security. And then SaaS is almost there like, hey, we do everything for you, right? And then the other side of the house is like just not having access to it or the volume. And sometimes it's both. I think a lot of times it's both. You think of SaaS tools like, M365, Okta, but then really, Netflix is a SaaS tool, right? Tinder is a SaaS tool. Not that your business is probably built on it, but who knows, right? Unless you're in the matchmaking game. But then you have all these like IT, HIRS, ITOM, ERP, acronym soup tools that a security team typically doesn't have visibility into, right? And now we're kind of at the precipice of like there's a lot of breaches that are born from these tools where they're able to laterally move from it, or they're just able to get at rich data for attackers, right? Maybe it's demographics data, maybe it's things on like accounts payable, accounts receivable, and then on top of that, there just isn't a lot of levers to pull, right? Where in AWS or in OCI or GCP and Azure, you have all sorts of like bells and whistles and toggles to be like, okay, I want to encrypt this. I want to use conditional access here. I want to have attribute-based access here. And your SSPM tool, or not your SSP, well, I guess maybe your SSPM tool too, because it's also a SaaS, but your SaaS tool may or may not have that. I mean, you have your industry giants that do have that. But then you have your smaller, kind of like mom and pop shop SaaS tools that don't have a lot of that configuration. You almost kind of live and die by identity if you could even use Federation, or if they don't charge you an arm and a leg per user for it. So there's also that financial aspect that you might just be locked out of better security, so to speak.
Yeah, I think you all make some great points in terms of the shared responsibility model. We kind of fall into that false sense of comfort, thinking that the security or the provider is doing everything. We have no responsibility. They're kind of doing everything for us, even though it's still our data, our reputation. There could be regulatory, legal ramifications, revenue, trust of the customer on the line, and things of that nature. And then Jonathan touched on the acronym soup that we often deal with in this space. We were kind of joking before we went online about this. Is you have CNAPS, CWPP, CSPM, SSPM. For a newcomer to this space, someone just getting their head around cloud security, it can be quite a lot. For folks not familiar, what exactly is CSPM and then SSPM, and what's the distinction between the two, and why do we need this new acronym or term for this? You want to take a shot at that, Jonathan?
Sure. I guess I'm the guilty party here since my open source tools, the SSPM, CSPM. So you could almost think of it generationally, right? Like going way, way back to like the crazy years of, I don't know, 2013, right? Like CSPM wasn't even called CSPM. So cloud security posture management, it might have been called like cloud configuration management or continuous cloud monitoring, whatever it was known by, it was just this really binary choice of making sure some of the things I mentioned before, like, hey, encryption, is ABAC on? Do we have encryption in transit on? Do we encrypt our volumes for our, cloud compute? That's really what those tools were meant for, just to check that kind of binary relationship of like, is this on or off? Is this on or off? And then that evolved into more of like the compliance piece where it was mapping the security controls into compliance. And then CSPM tools started to bloat, and we got a lot of like Gartner-born acronyms like cloud infrastructure entitlement management, KIM. Then we got cloud workload protection, or whatever CWPP is. And it started to climb up the ladder of adding more capability sets surrounded around that IaaS infrastructure. And SSPM kind of sort of went through that route. I mean, you have a big component of SaaS is identity, right? You have your identity governance and access tools. You have, things that are sitting in the middle, like your cloud access security broker tools. Then that also brings in like zero trust network access and SACE, which I'm even going to try to say what SACE stands for. I don't know what it is, but I see it everywhere. SSPM's kind of followed that track where it's like, okay, let's check if you have configurations on, like, do you turn on Salesforce Shield? Do you disallow certain content headers? Do you disallow certain types of MIME types and files in ServiceNow? Do you have a private instance? Things like that, right? And there's not a whole lot of levers to pull, like I was mentioning before. And then now it's kind of a lot more comprehensive where you're still looking at configurations, and it's very centered on identity now. At least all the good SSPM tools are, where you're looking at user permission settings. You're looking if users are over permissioned. You're looking if users are even used, if they're kind of like orphaned away from your central just-in-time SAML and configuration. So I guess that's the best way to think of it, right? Is SSPM is CSPM for SaaS with some identity stuff built into it.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And so I want to ask Alec, from your perspective, obviously App Omni's, really heavy in the space of having the SSPM tooling and kind of leading the charge within the industry among, some other peers in the group. When you guys look at the SaaS landscape, and this is something Jonathan touched on, is kind of the diverse maturity among them. You may have an Office 365 that has robust capabilities and configurations, and then you may have a SaaS startup that's just bootstrapped from a seed round and trying to get to the market and get some adoption and has limited configuration changes and things like that. How do you guys approach covering the different SaaS tools, that the enterprises are using? Is it prioritized based on, market share and adoption, and then how do you kind of empower organizations to secure that diverse landscape of SaaS vendors out there?
It's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of rabbit holes we can go down here describing what a good vendor looks like, right? Like, how do you actually define that? From our approach on what applications we prioritize for coverage, a lot of it's just prioritized on where's the most spend occurring, what's the level of adoption, and then where the skeletons lie within an organization. And a lot of times these fall on less products that you wouldn't necessarily consider just a application, right? They're more ecosystems. So if you look at Salesforce isn't just a small application that's used by a lot of people. It's a massive ecosystem with the ability to build your own plugins and own applications on top of it. You even see it with like the certification track, like the number of certifications you can have to be an architect within that space. And you look at all the third parties that are connected to it, it really becomes more, sometimes we refer to it as the operating system of modern business, right? Like, it's not just this application that you use for a point solution. It's something that your entire business is often built around. And so we prioritize those with Salesforce, ServiceNow, M365, Workday, because that is where the majority of that risk lies within the organization. You can try to tackle all 500 applications that an enterprise uses at once. Good luck. If you have the time to do that, like that, great. You're the only team that I've ever talked to that has that ability. You always start out with prioritization. You prioritize based off of risk, and we did the same approach within our application. But go ahead, Chris.
No, I was gonna say it makes a lot of sense to start from that perspective. I figure that's how you guys tackled it, is kind of who's using what, in terms of, I kind of think of it as like, what's most concentration of risk within the software supply chain, and start with those vendors essentially.
Exactly. Because that's the way we would expect, like as an organization, you do your business impact analysis. We did the same thing on the product side to understand what we need to be building first and why, and then, continue on from there. So that was really, I feel like what the first part of your question was, Chris. And I think the second part becomes probably more interesting, really, to understand what a secure SaaS vendor looks like, or how do you evaluate these SaaS vendors? Is that an accurate read back?
Yeah. Let's dive into that. We kind of talked a little bit about this offline before we jumped on air here. Is like, obviously there's the standard of, do they have a SOC 2? Is it FedRAMP authorized? Those kind of things, compliance frameworks, which are important depending on your industry and regulatory requirements. But what are some other considerations if I'm looking to use a SaaS provider? What do I need to look at? What should I be concerned with? What kind of things should I be checking out?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of what you just spoke to kind of falls within the standard due diligence of evaluating any vendor. You're looking at their third-party assessments. You're looking at understanding their encryption practices. How do they store data? How do they manage the data? The two pieces I think are most interesting to drill on from a overall programmatic perspective is what are the maturity of their APIs that tells you what you can do programmatically to secure the posture of that organization or manage the posture of that organization. And then you look at the logs, which is telling you what happened within the organization. It enables you to identify suspicious and respond to it. So if you don't have a healthy level of maturity within both of those areas, you're going to have gaps. So just drilling into it for the posture side. So you're looking at the APIs. The more configurations you have, and specifically the security settings that are most interesting to us that are API accessible, the better, because you can actually feed that and programmatically monitor those and provide continuous monitoring throughout those settings. If it's not API accessible, like there's some applications out there that if you look at the UI, they have maybe 26 configurations that you can use to secure an environment. You look at the APIs, they maybe have 2. And so in theory, you could go and manually manage each one of those configurations within those applications. But practically, that you're not going to do that. It's effectively impossible to do. And that's why you need that API first approach. And then on the log side, you're looking at more of the reactive security. You're looking at how do you respond to identify and respond to suspicious activity. You're really looking at the breadth of the event categories that are contained within that log, and then you're looking at the depth of those events within each one of those categories within the logs. And if an event isn't actually logged by the application, you can't detect it. And so getting as granular as you can is what you need within both the posture side and reactive side, or excuse me, the detection side. And really, one thing that we've seen this question a ton with our customers. One thing that we've done to help us answer it in a more cohesive and comprehensive way is to come out with something that we recently open sourced called our event maturity matrix, which provides that starting point to allow customers to evaluate vendors that they do business or are looking to do business with. And more broadly, giving the community just this language to describe the SaaS maturity or the maturity of a SaaS vendor, as well as a yardstick to measure the maturity of those various applications or various vendors against each other. And really, this is going to be an evolving matrix that we're looking for a ton of collaboration within the community. We wanted to just lead by doing, get it out there. And we're going to be following up with a posture side maturity matrix here shortly to allow customers to understand the how to actually evaluate the maturity of the various APIs that are out there.
Yeah, sounds like a great resource for the community. I'll definitely have to check that out. And then from your side, David, I know you've been helping lead a SaaS governance and security program in a pretty large, complex environment. How are you guys helping this agency, this customer, kind of navigate like what SaaS providers look like in terms of security posture and maturity, and like how to navigate the decision around using or not using, and to what extent,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So we're doing it's a combination of using SSPM tools, other vendor risk management tools, as well as doing an actual crosswalk, looking at those artifacts. And Alec and both Jonathan touched on just getting a sense of the third party compliance aspect, the overall network infrastructure, getting those diagrams and other artifacts, and then mapping those on the back end to we have a whole control matrix and a whole evaluation process. But again, it's taking that whole process and really taking a holistic approach with SSPM tools as well as other vendor risk management platforms, and reviewing those artifacts from those SaaS vendors.
Yeah, it makes sense. Getting to a kind of risk-based approach for decision around using or not using, and so on. Jonathan, Alex said something that made me want to ask you a question. He talked about logging and telemetry. You've been known to talk about logging and telemetry once or twice in your life. So I'm curious, from your perspective, you have all these SaaS providers. Maybe you have 200, 300, 400. You're a large enterprise environment. And there goes our guest speaker for today. How are you, if you're an enterprise, how are you making sense of this, all this logging data, right? If you're bringing this into your environment, you're trying to monitor all these disparate SaaS environments at the same time, in addition to your, already existing SOC or SIEM activity. How do you kind of make sense of all that data?
Sec data ops, baby. Let's go. Well, first off, it depends if they even emit audit logs, right? I think that's something that's missing. A lot of times you'll find that the SaaS provider, aside from like the huge ecosystems, right, that everybody knows, like your Workdays, your Salesforces, your ServiceNows, when you start to get a little bit outside of that territory, then it's like, maybe they don't even have SAML, and maybe they don't let you use it for free, right? They might charge you an arm and a leg for it. And then when you get into like audit logging, that's a completely different beast. Alec was kind of touching on it before about, the different events and the different metadata that's exposed by these tools, if they even have it, right? And if they do have it, a lot of times you're going to be missing events where, you might be able to capture things like, hey, a new user is created, a user is updated, we hooked you up with SCIM or if a JIT platform. But then, further down, it's like if somebody's taking action inside of the apps, and kind of on the other side of it, it's like, well, do we even care if somebody's modifying a table or modifying a customer relationship inside of my, ERM or CSM tool, whatever it happens to be, right? So the first thing that makes sense of is, where are the audit logs and how do they vend them? How do they store them? And then, to make your life easier as a security team, it's kind of normalizing the data. That's a lot of what we deal with at Query, and it's something that we come up against a lot when we're in prospecting conversations. Like, hey, we have all these different SaaS tools. Can you integrate Query with them? We go along our discovery, and it's like, well, Either it costs an arm and a leg for their API, or they just might not have any audit or event data that gets emitted. If they do, you still have to take even a further step back, right? And be like, well, why are we collecting it? What's the purpose of it? How does this fit within our threat model, within our risk management lens? Be it, if it's regulatory compliance, that's kind of behooves us to collect this data for, well, because they tell us to, we have to, or is it for, something a little bit more, of a salient issue, right? So getting there, it's, normalizing that data, being able to identify the components of the events, of the logs, and then have a way to enrich or at least correlate back, right? I mean, a lot of the SaaS tools, again, are going to be, surfaced by or interfaced with by, either SAML or IDC. So maybe we could get that before then. Maybe use an SSPM tool to funnel that stuff into, right? And then pull it out. That's essentially what the SSPM tool is there for. And then if not, getting it into a format, whether you're indexing it inside of Splunk or you're putting it into Databricks and a Snowflake and a Redshift, or you just have it in S3 Parquet files and you're querying it with Spectrum or with Athena or with Trino to be able to, understand what the important things you're looking for. Does somebody updating a bunch of customers at once, is that like a threat, or is that just part of some CRM process? Is somebody dumping a bunch of users a threat, or is that because you have just-in-time configuration, you onboarded a bunch of new team members, right? So there's a lot of rabbit holes that we could get into, like Alec was saying there. I guess the easy thing, right, if we wanted to be a shill, it's like buy an SSPM tool.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you guys. So we've talked a lot about, getting logging, telemetry, the importance of an SSPM tool, the capabilities that it provides to securing your SaaS footprint. But on the, flip side of that, on the beginning of it, a critical security control for a long, long time now, decades, has been like software asset inventory. From my experience and my research, most organizations have a very poor understanding of their SaaS SaaS footprint, let alone starting to secure these configurations and environments. In your guys' experience, how do you go about helping an organization even navigating, understanding what SaaS they're consuming, let alone is it secure? Should they be using it for what type of data? Those kind of things. Most organizations have, I think last I saw, between 200 and 300 SaaS providers. It may be one thing to go in AWS and kind of enumerate your footprint or your presence, but in SaaS, it's a lot more complicated, especially with large environments where people have discretionary budgets across different business offices and things like that. People can use a credit card, just spin it up and start putting data from the corporation or enterprise in there. How do you start navigating that process of even understanding what you're using, let alone start to secure it? What do you think, Dave? You want to kick us off on that one?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a challenge. I mean, you just really hit on it, where you have all these different teams, and they all, from my perspective, just working, as a or in IT and so forth on different teams. SaaS almost, we touched on a little bit earlier, where SaaS is almost an afterthought, where you have like the marketing, the sales, all these teams, and they're going out and looking and purchasing SaaS for some features that they want, right? They're looking at certain features for their job that they can provide a report to their boss, and then they come to IT and say, okay, we got this SaaS application, we need it integrated with SSO. And so at that point, then IT gets involved and does the configuration with SSO, but then there's no one really managing SaaS. And so that's where like SSPM tools really come into play, where you can actually have that asset inventory of SaaS and start looking at the baseline configuration of those SaaS environments and so forth. And then go from there and start protecting the environments and gaining the insight into them is really beneficial.
Yeah. So Alec, from your perspective, like when you guys start to engage a customer or, an enterprise, and obviously you want to use SSPM to start to secure their SaaS footprint, but how do you help to get them have a handle on what they're even using to begin with, which is often a challenge, especially like in a large environment with different business units and things like that?
Yeah, I'd say yes and no. I mean, a lot of the kind of going back to what applications have the most sensitive data, what have the most users, what have the most complexity to them, where does the overall greatest risk lie? You probably know where those applications are. I mean, there's always going to be risk in a blind spot. So it's not to say that you ignore that. You certainly don't. I mean, that's one value proposition of a tool like ours, or just any efforts that are spent securing SaaS, it's currently a blind spot for most organizations. A small bit of investment has a very big return. But I'd say in general, when you look at where is the most sensitive data, something like a Workday, you know you have Workday. Are you doing anything to secure Workday first? If you are, start looking at those third-party apps that are connected to Workday, because oftentimes you can identify not just where the greatest core risk is, but then the downstream effects with those connected applications to those core applications that you have. But I'd say over time, it's largely there's so many ways to work around whatever process you have or whatever tool you have to identify these SaaS applications. And we provide the ability to discover these SaaS applications that are connected within the network. But a lot of it, I think, comes down to helping customers build a program around that this tool enables. So how do you understand, how do you build the bridge between IT and security? You're always going to have one or two folks, like you talk to healthcare, like doctors going to do what doctors do. And if that means they download one application that they are, convinced they are absolutely need for their job, they're going to do that. But how do you build the relationship, like any security team, between IT within the rest of the business to be a value-added stakeholder and not just the guy or gal who says no? So I think the tools play a part of it, but the program and relationships have a huge role into it as well. And I think it's easy to say, like, hey, we're just going to buy this tool and we're going to solve this problem. The harder work of building and running the program, I think, is really where you get the value.
No, I agree with that. I think overall your governance approach and even just your like relationship management, right? The larger your organization is, depending on the industry, it's always going to be more complex to get a hold of. I mean, back in the day, right, we're on-prem and everything we access is through a DMZ, through a firewall. You would use something like, App ID off of your Panorama, or you would have like Sky High Networks in line, which is now McAfee CNAP, I think. Or, you're using MCAS, which I guess is Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. Whatever the way is, you had some sort of dragnet that would just catch it all. But then, if you're like new to the SSPM space, right? Like if I just gave an analyst or an engineer or an architect, like, okay, here you go, an MCAS, it captures literally everything, go back to my first comment about like a lot of things are SaaS tools kind of just by their purpose, right? How they're built, that might not be business SaaS tools. So then all of a sudden you have this like app catalog of 2,000 applications, and some of it's like TikTok.com, some of it's like Maps.com, Weather.com, and it's like, is this really SaaS? Like, how do we use this? It could get really confusing really quick. Ideally, you're in an environment, again, governance, program, relationship management, that somebody, be it your technology business management group, if you have one, or IT financial management, whatever you call it, your procurement, accounts payable, accounts receivable, your vendor risk management team, maybe if they sit like under a chief compliance officer, chief security officer organization, if you have a privacy team that's doing a lot of these crosswalks and, data privacy workflows, right, that have the discovery kind of legwork done, or your IT team. But there are places like Alec mentioned where, HMO organizations I've worked in where a doctor or a program lead could just like swipe a credit card. And if you have no dragnet, you have no way to intercept that. You have no, log inside of, whatever you're doing for your, book of business, wherever your accounts payable receivable go to, it's going to be really hard to discover it. And, again, piggyback on what Alex said, right? Like your center of gravity, like your big meaty ecosystem SaaS, you're always going to know where it is. But like you mentioned, people fall short there. It's like, okay, we're using Workday. We'll just, go through the Workday, we'll go through the Salesforce like security best recommendations guide, or we'll work with an architect, or we'll hire a certified person. But then you have a ginormous plugin ecosystem and an API ecosystem that could be attached into it natively, or that you could be building externally. And God knows where all that stuff goes to, right? I mean, that's a nightmare, not just for SaaS security, but for vendor risk, for finance, where, now you could be having all these sub line items, sub SKUs underneath, or SKU, however you're supposed to pronounce that, right? Underneath that one big SaaS app, that it's like, okay, this is just one. And then in reality, it's like, well, there's like 110 tools inside of just one. And that's only one ecosystem. Now do that 100 more times. I'd be resigning.
There's a trust and verify need that needs to exist with those third-party applications too, because just because they received whatever the platform vendor's stamp of approval is to be a certified application at one point in time, it's not continuously monitored. I mean, you can, as soon as you get certified to be on an app, like a platform's app store, you can change that application later in the day and they're not going to detect that. And so you have just this pool of sprawling risks with those third-party applications that it's just, you need a way to programmatically manage it, because if not, there's no way you do it manually.
Yeah, I'm curious your guys' perspective. So in my experience, like implementing these kind of tools and programs, you run into the age-old security problem of if you start to elevate or escalate and make risks visible of a certain SaaS provider, for example, but the business really wants to use this, it's so convenient, everyone loves it. In your guys' experience, how have you gone about navigating that conversation of saying, like, we understand you like to use X SaaS, but here's some critical risks that you need to be concerned about that exists with this provider, whether it's recent breaches or vulnerabilities that have been exploited, or misconfigurations that are kind of prevalent, or just not integrating well with an SSPM tool, et cetera. How do you kind of navigate that conversation of not being a blocker, as they often call, security, the office of no, but also elevating that risk to the business so that they can go about using it securely or even using it at all? Dave, you want to dive in on that one first?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a delicate balance. That's one thing. Being a contractor working with a larger customer, there's certain teams and individuals that are working with consultants that support those programs, and again, it's that delicate balance of using a tool that identifies risks and is looking at misconfigurations and sort of taking a peek under the hood. um, and those consultants are selling their services to support those applications. So it is a huge challenge. The way that I've approached it is more or less by using those tools and finding either features or having the conversation with them to look at how these tools and the processes can actually optimize their support and their services, instead of looking at it like, hey, this is a misconfiguration, you're not doing your job, right? Because again, it's balancing that out. And it's interesting, I know Alex touched on like third-party integrations, and even in general, misconfigurations within SaaS applications. It's not always an IT admin or a security practitioner that just sets up everyone as an admin and just blindly does that. There's other circumstances that come about in other scenarios where, like, for example, Bob is the SharePoint admin. So when we spun up this SaaS app, Bob has to be an admin to do his SharePoint connection. And then after he does that, it's done, it works, and then no one ever circles back 8 months later and notices that Bob's still an admin within the application. So it's again, having that conversation, understanding that there are other circumstances and scenarios at play, and not so much like, hey, we ran a scan on your environment and there's 15 issues. Why aren't you doing your job? So that's again, it is a tricky situation to be in, but you have to balance out those conversations.
How about you, Gath? In your experience, how have you gone about, kind of informing the business and making recommendations without, being thrown out of the room for being a blocker?
Yeah, I mean, well, you're not allowed to be a blocker, right? I think back to my old bosses, Eric. He was the CISO at IHS Markit before we were acquired by S&P Global. And when I took the original role of being like head of cloud security architecture, engineering, risk, that eventually grew into red teaming and OffSec. In addition to that, he was like, hey, remember, guardrails, not breaks. Where at the end of the day, the business, they're making money, they're paying our checks, right? So telling them no to a decision they already made, like, that dog don't hunt, that ain't going to work at all, right? So it's more about, kind of getting to them with the what, like, what's this issue that you identified, and then the so what. And the so what really hinges on like your understanding of, God forgive me for the meme security language, the materiality, right, of it. Maybe you have a security research team, or maybe you have a threat intelligence team, or it's part of your threat model, part of your risk management framework, whatever it needs to be. Maybe it's at the enterprise level, information risk management level, or, again, it's like a, hey, you must do this because regulatory component said so. And it's like, all right, well, we have no choice. Getting that so what across of like, hey, this issue we identified of everybody's an admin, like, what's the so what there? Sometimes the business is like, so, like, we don't understand fine grained permissions. And then they're like, you fix it. And then it gets thrown back to you and you're like, oh God, I don't know what this, what this model is. And then, you know, an action plan, right? Like what's next after that? So what of, you know, what can we do? And maybe that's using tools as part of your program. Cause like Alec mentioned before, there's no way you're going to get to the sprawl on top of it. So it's just kind of really picking your battles and then dealing with, you know, formative changes within your overall security program, be it a SaaS governance, a SaaS security specific practice, or as part of cloud security, enterprise security, wherever it fits in your organization, right? And just because it's formative doesn't mean it's easy. That could be to reducing admins. That could be like, hey, let's use SSO. If we don't already use SSO, let's plumb out these audit logs. If we don't, let's evaluate an SSPM tool. If we don't, let's evaluate an IGA tool, a SACE tool, a acronym soup, whatever it needs to be, right? Like there's different steps that you could take that aren't going to be an overnight thing, but have to be part of your game plan. And then as a security leader, you know, as part of that program, be it, you know, a specific chunk like cloud security and OffSec, or if you're the CISO, especially at a giant place, it's, you know, being able to pick that battle, but being able to pick that battle in context of where you could expend your human capital to, because let's face it, at the end of the day, our teams are small and they're getting smaller with all, you know, the rifts and the economic geopolitical pressures that are going on. You really can't be, you know, bringing up these issues, even if there is materiality, even if there is, you know, actual like actions that are being taken on the objective, so to speak, like, hey, this SaaS tool like bears a risk because of that. And you got to make sure that you analyze if that one floats to the top of like your fires to put out list. And everybody has a really long list of fires to put out. I mean, that's the nature of our job. That's what keeps us employed. And then being able to figure that out, but partnering with them, right? That goes back to the what, so what next? It's like if you give them a game plan and you push that back to your partners in IT or your partners in product or even in the business, because a lot of time the business people, you know, be it biz dev, account managers, whatever, they might also double as the admin for that specific SaaS tool. And security people might hear that and cringe, but it's like, hey, do you know how to use MuleSoft? I sure as hell don't. So, you know, maybe trust these people as well to actually do their jobs if you do yours right.
Yeah, how about you, Alec? What's your take on, you know, how to, you talked about this a little bit earlier with IT, you know, security and the business, like when you come in and try to start to evaluate some of these SaaS apps or raise some of the risks to the business, and it's obviously, you know, they want to use these vendors and tools, you know, how do you go about navigating that conversation without, you know, experiencing a lot of pushback from the business side?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say trying to do it without pushback isn't necessarily the goal. It's just reducing that pushback and moving past it. I mean, David and Jonathan made a lot of great points, so I don't want to just. I'm at risk of just echoing exactly what they said, but what sticks out top of mind for me, and mentioned it before, is, you know, it's a discussion that's made productive by having foundational relationships with your stakeholders. If you know, to Jonathan's point, if they view you as the guy who's just looking for an excuse to say no, whether that's because you're incredibly risk averse or because it creates more work for you, whatever that understanding is, if that's their perspective of you, even if you don't feel like that's your perspective, you're fighting an uphill battle that you really can't win. So it's building that goodwill so that folks understand that your sole motive is to figure out a way to get to yes. And that if there is eventually going to be a veto, like, man, you're using that veto card very sparingly, if you can even use it. But more often than not, you're just saying, hey, I want to make sure that I'm helping identify the risks. I'm informing the decision maker, because rarely are you going to be the decision maker. And that ultimately your job at the end is to mitigate the resulting risk. And that's why we have controls. So it's just a matter of, can you do that effectively, or what's blocking you? And there's a crawl, walk, run approach to this. To enumerate those risks further, to further identify them, validate what you had hypothesized, what we often recommend with customers is don't onboard your production environment right away. Identify something that's a little bit lower risk, something that follows that crawl, walk, run. Get a sandbox in, right? Like something that the IT owner or somebody else in the organization is totally comfortable with you, or at least can be very much more readily comfortable having onboarded onto a tool like an SSPM tool, to just bring that shared understanding. Because what we end up seeing, like, I mean, there's a universality to this comment, but like, shared understanding is what builds the bridge between people in life. Any mistrust is often based off of some sort of misunderstanding. Not to say that, you know, you can understand squarely what the other person thinks and just have a vehement disagreement there. Not to say that's not the case, but what we've often seen is a tool like ours, or, you know, an SSPM, can help translate security to IT so that the IT team understands why the security team is as concerned as they are. And then the IT team can then have a shared understanding back to the security team to say, the security team doesn't understand the application that they're being asked to secure. So they're looking for that understanding. So in that shared understanding of the IT owner understanding security more, the security team understanding the specifics of the application more, it helps build that bridge so you can have a productive conversation. And something like a tool like this enumerates those, enumerates facets of the conversation that may have been trying to have for years, but they just couldn't actually articulate, didn't have like a good forum to actually discuss.
Yeah, it's a super practical take, and it talks to the reality of what many organizations and teams are dealing with when trying to secure these kind of emerging tools and technologies like SaaS and so on. And Jonathan, you actually touched on something that made me want to bring up another question. Is you talked about sometimes it may be the business unit or someone on the business side actually managing this SaaS app because the security team just simply isn't familiar with it. They don't use it. They have no interest in it. For example, say you have a large enterprise with 300 different SaaS apps. It's not practical for the security team to understand the context of usage for what purpose and all the configurations that, of every single tool. I've found in my experience, it's somewhat better to kind of take a tool like an SSPM and empower the people using the SaaS tool, or the SaaS vendor, I should say, to kind of like, clean their own bedroom, take the tool, help them empower them to kind of clean up their own environment and understand the risks associated with their usage of a SaaS vendor. In your all this experience, how have you guys rolled this kind of a tool out and help empower people to take action themselves versus it all funneling back to the security team who can only monitor and have so much context on so many things at once?
No, usually it's not the tool itself, right? I mean, you have to manage your own risk. And at the end of the day, I don't want a bunch of admins in my security tool that has a bird's eye view and a really empowered view of certain aspects to all these other SaaS ecosystems and tools, right? I mean, this kind of goes back to Sec Data Ops, right? Where it's like, hey, if we have a layer where we can normalize a lot of this data, businesses kind of live and die by BI, right? So if you have a way to plumb that data out of that SSPM tool where it's your nexus, and again, it depends on what the tool is exactly doing. If it's like more identity focused, if it's more config focused, if it's like a best of breed type tool, you might be able to get insights out of it. And to your previous discussion that we just had with the other question, it's you should be showing back stuff that actually makes sense to them, right? Like don't just show them gauge charts and line charts of like, oh, issues over time. Remember your audience. Like these guys are, and girls, right, are business folks. They're managing these tools because it serves a business purpose. Security has really no business, no pun intended, dealing with an ITFM tool. Like they don't know what a cost pool and a cost tower, what any of that is inside of like an Apptio. They don't really understand how to like set up sales pipelines in the CRM tool. But if there are issues and you do identify them there, and then there's that meme language, materiality, there's that actual impact or supposed impact with it, give it back to them in a way, even a tasking, even if it's just an email, right? At the end of the day, as long as there's, to Alex explain, a shared understanding about what's going on, how to actually read the reports. If you are vending out reports to them, if your team is, SecDevOps focused, then they're able to do that. Or you have some other communications mechanism for them just to kind of burn that list down. And in my experience, at least, having dealt with, dozens, if not hundreds of business leaders, of admins, of, people who are running these tools, they're usually more than happy to actually configure it for you, right? I mean, I think back to even just that Lightspin. We had a woman who was kind of like our MarOps for a bit, like running these different like CRM tools and Salesforce. And she was like, do you want to log in? I was like, God, no. And I was a CISO at the time. I was like, I don't know anything about Salesforce or anything about like how to actually use these tools, right? But working with her about like, hey, here's different things. We can integrate with Defender. We could turn this on. We could turn this on. Do we have a license for it? Is this going to incur too much cost? And then she's like, okay, great. I'm the SME. I'm the subject matter expert. Like, yeah, I'll go and do that. Then you have a couple touch points and you run it just like a project. So sometimes it's just really that easy, having that open communication, but not overwhelming them. And that's also a formative step to take to like educate yourself, maybe not on how to like be a power user of the tool, but your SSPM tool might be telling you that, oh, ServiceNow doesn't have this thing turned on, right? And then actually reading into it, it's like, what is this thing? What does it do? Why is it important? Because just checking boxes on security best practices, sure, they might be a best practice, but if it's not for a feature you use, or if it's not going to mitigate a risk, if it's not going to implement the control you need, then why are you doing it? You're just doing security work to do security work, and that's security theater, and nobody likes that. If I want a theater, I'd go to an AMC.
Yeah, you raise a lot of great points there, and I like the aspect of how it comes back to the people and building that rapport and trust, and having that line of communication with the people using the applications. Dave, from your perspective at Acquia, implementing these kind of programs and tools, how have you worked with the people that are using these SaaS vendors to kind of empower them to understand the risk of what they're using and the findings, and like let them kind of take action on some stuff themselves, for example?
Yeah, no, that's a very valid point that Jonathan brought up. Because that's something. We've had a lot of adoption with Salesforce. I'm not a Salesforce admin, never been, as well. And but working with those support teams, it's a lot of it is like I said, having those conversations and really looking at how can we optimize their workflow, right? They're the sales, or not, yeah, they're the Salesforce admin, subject matter experts within that platform. And what can I do to optimize their workflow? Are there certain features of the tool? Sure, like it'll tell them, run a scan and say these settings are on or off, and this is a risk and why it's a risk. But one example is for App Omni is the compliance scanning and the reporting functionality, which has optimized the support team's workflow with continuous authorization and assessment, where because we can actually automate those compliance reports and get them scheduled and sent out to the proper individuals, they don't actually have to go through lengthy audits once a quarter. So my approach is, again, looking at it, not being combative with them, trying to tell them, these settings are misconfigured. You need to go correct them, because I'm on the security side. It's more, okay, how can we work together? How can we optimize your workflow to make this tool work for you? Instead of, again, just here's a report that says, go fix these items.
Yeah,
if I
go ahead,
could jump into real quick. I love everything that David and Jonathan are saying. One thing that comes top of mind, and I realize there's a bit of an irony in saying this, because despite my current outfit, I've never worked in sales and don't have any desire to actually work in sales. I know Jonathan was thinking it, so I wanted to call it right out. But I think to this, it speaks to the power of a sales skill set, right? Like, understand the visceral problems that the person that you're talking to wants to solve, and what's going to make their life easier, and then show them how this tool is going to do it. And like, obviously, a vendor can help you do that. They would be more than happy to help you do that. But it's just a basic understanding of what causes somebody pain and frustration. What can this tool do to solve it? If you can show that connection, then you're going to have somebody who eagerly welcomes this into their sphere. And as somebody who's I touched compliance at one point in my career, but originally did not. And always viewed compliance as a 4-letter word, and always just the people who can't do security go into compliance. And it's like, that's just one, it's not true. But all right, man, I Jonathan's my ringer here. But at the end of the day, you realize it's critically important, and it's what costs you a ton of money if you screw up. So businesses really, really care about it. So a compliance job is critically important. And doing compliance on, let's just say, at a low number, 100 SaaS applications is a freaking nightmare. It's just like, so if you can use, like, our product's going to help you provide compliance across those products. Okay, that's going to that's going to get you a ton of goodwill with that person and have an eagerness for them to adopt this product. So the hard part is just opening up that conversation and understanding the problem that you need to solve with them, and then showing them how this tool is going to do this. Because this includes cost optimization, right? Like, you can show that you are over provisioned by a tremendous amount, right? Like, deprovision all these inactive users that have been active for 2-3 years. Show how you can help with audits, show how you can help with compliance, show how in general you can overall reduce the risk profile. Even though I'd say that's probably the most impactful, but one that's least likely to resonate outside of the security sphere. There's just a ton you can do with these tools. And so figuring out how it's connected to somebody's job and solving their problems is huge.
Yeah, I think you raise a lot of points that'll get people's attention in terms of why these tools are valuable and how to go about using them and get business benefit from doing so. So I wanted to stick with you for 1 second. We had a question come in from the audience. We've talked a lot about SSPM tools. Obviously, Alec, you've worked for a vendor that sells an SSPM tool and is deep in this space. Jonathan is the author of an open source tool that does this. David's been working with App Omni and other tools in this space. So starting with you, Alec, one of the questions from the audience was, how do you recommend customers vet SSPM providers? If I'm looking to start using the SSPM tool, what should I be looking for? What should jump out to me?
I think we talk about this a lot, obviously. It's our space. And the biggest thing is just depth of understanding within these applications because they are a massive ecosystem. So, does the product support the depth of the usage that you have within an application? Which, for something like M365, or ServiceNow, or Workday, or any of these larger applications, is going to be massive. So, you need somebody who, not just when you talk to them, understands that application, not just at a topical level, but deeply. Somebody that can talk to the admin of that application and have credibility, but then have a tool that backs it up because you don't want to just have the human being connected to it. A lot of credibility comes from that human of, hey, I trust this guy or gal. They seem to really know what they're talking about. But then within the tool, does it support the controls that you care most about? Does it teach you something that you didn't know beforehand? Compare these tools side by side. What's flagging what risk? What's the delta between these, and what's going to provide the most impact in your opinion? I mean, there's a handful of players in this space, but really like showing, not telling, I think is what's going to have the biggest impact. And so have the initial conversation, onboard them, test them, but really scrutinize the heck out of them of, does this tell you something that you really didn't know that you really need to know now and act on? Or is it just kind of confirming something that you already knew?
And then, Jonathan, I'm curious your take. On one hand, you know the SSPM tool space well, but you have an open source tool that people could take and use and not necessarily have to pay. But then they may bug Jonathan with a lot of feature requests and pull requests for things that have to do with the open source tool as well. So when you talk SSPM with organizations, how do you go about advising them? How to pursue which tool they want to use or tools they want to use?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess step zero is like make sure you actually have a need for it, right? If it's something that you could do within your own confines, even if it's just focused on the ecosystem, if it's well within your team's capability at the start. And again, this is like for folks in startups where we're not going to have that many SaaS tools. I mean, you can if you want, but if you hate money, I guess, or you're well funded. But for the most part, folks like me in the startup space, there's not a whole lot of them. And I think even if you have a one-person shop on the security side, they could likely manage it. But then if you're not there, which most buyers are, right, they're in enterprise mid-market, it's understanding that depth of coverage. First off, does it support at least the key players that you need, right? Like, if I was looking at a tool, it's like, oh, we don't support Workday or Salesforce or 365 or ServiceNow. I'd be like, what are you doing then, right? And then next, it's like, not to focus too much on the capability side, but like Alec mentioned, is it getting to the depth that you need? Is it something that you didn't know how to surface, right? And really, I would be looking for something that has, it's looking at configurations, it's looking at identity, it's looking at those events that kind of has that threat detection, maybe not response, but at least threat detection capabilities, that has some strong, best practice reporting or compliance monitoring reporting across all of it, all the different SaaS tools you're using. For me, an electric guy, I have to support tools I could get easy access to. Salesforce lets you have a free dev platform with like everything turned on for it. Google Workspace, I have to pay for it, but it's only $7 a month for me, so it's not really that big of a deal for one of my domains. ServiceNow, same thing. As long as you remember to turn the damn thing on, you could have a personal development instance as well, especially as they have new release versions. And I believe even 365 will let you have a kind of student evaluation license as well. So I'm more focused there. And then it's mostly on best practices, right? It's things that people are using a lot because I'm putting my time into it really for free, right? So I'm not going to support some one-off tool. But I look at it more from like the configuration, a little bit on the identity space, more like, are you even using SSO? Do you have MFA turned on? Is everybody a damn admin, right? And that's kind of the simplistic view, but really the idea of using Electric Eye, it's kind of like, all right, I have all my public cloud. I have all three of my SaaS tools that I support in one place. And it's just like a quick view into it. I would say if you're doing a bake-off, maybe use Electric Eye alongside of it. And if my jank freaking Python open source tool has more capability than the person who wants you to give them $1 million a year, uppercut them. And then, I don't know, give me like $500, 308's expensive.
How about you, Dave? You've worked with organizations implementing these tools. How do you go about, helping them evaluate SSPM tooling and kind of navigate, what's worth pursuing and implementing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because it's something that's come up. I mean, I know like we're using App Omni, but it's a good question and it has come up. It's like, is it what else is out there, right? So we're looking at, and I've actually evaluated other ones, and Alec and Jonathan both touched on some really key points. But another point that I want to make too is when you talk about like the depth of coverage and coverage, one thing to keep in mind too is that every SaaS environment is unique. Every SaaS environment is different, and that's something that you should also keep in mind when you're evaluating SSPM products, because one thing that I've noticed when I compare, App Omni versus other products is the other ones don't quite have the level of depth where the information that you get is actually very basic and kind of generic, and it doesn't really account for that, where it doesn't quite go as deep as like App Omni does, for example, where they understand that Salesforce and Slack and Box are unique environments, and they go very in depth with the level of coverage for the configurations and so forth. So, I don't want to echo their points too much, but that's another point that I wanted to mention when you're evaluating SSPM products.
Awesome. Yeah, sounds good. So we're down to the last, a few minutes of the conversation here. So I'll do a quick, around the table. I'll start with you, Alec. If you're an organization, looking to get started with, SSPM, but also more broadly SaaS security, and just starting to get a handle on your SaaS consumption and securing that consumption, any key recommendations, a couple of top recommendations on how to get started?
One, reach out to us. That's an easy way to start it. I would say, not to just put in a shameless plug, I would say just understand that you mentioned it before, that there's an inverted risk model here where you hold a tremendous amount of data that's very sensitive in these applications. Just look at the applications that are critical to your job on a daily basis, or ask 5 other people in different parts of the business, and you're going to realize it's almost certainly going to be SaaS applications. And then ask yourself what you're currently doing to secure the usage of those applications. And it's probably nothing. And so a little bit of an investment of time, money, thought power to this area is likely to have a disproportionate impact, rather than throwing more time, money, attention into an area that you've been focused on for 3 or 4 years.
How about you, Jonathan?
Just go out and use the tool, right? I mean, it's a burgeoning space. Every day we're seeing more attacks. Not that, seeing attacks on the news is the way that you should run your security program. But at the end of the day, even if you're at a startup, you probably at least have 5 or 10 of it. I think it's probably start time to evaluate them. I mean, we're starting to see the CNET vendors move into the space a little bit. I think Wiz has like Google Workspace support now. I bet we'll continue to see convergence in there. But until then, find a best of breed tool, especially if you have, heavy SaaS usage, right? Be it App Omni. I think Cloudflare has like Cloudflare One. Adaptive Shield's another well-known SSPM tool. Electric Eye, is for free 99. You just got to, fill out a TOML config and, run a Docker container. Whatever it needs to be, just get started, and then also delineate the responsibility for SaaS security. I think that question came through either here or on LinkedIn about who owns it. I mean, obviously the knee-jerk reaction is like, oh, security owns it because it's security. But again, a lot of these tools, super nuanced, have very, very specific business logic to use it. So maybe identify a joint task force or a steering community or whatever you want to do, and probably do that first, right? Understand kind of the governance, the shared responsibility, to use that term, about between IT, the business teams, the product teams, and as well as security. And then, kind of go on from there. And within that criteria that you folks all identify, then pick an SSPM tool. But since Alec's here, you should, talk to him. Sharply dressed man, not a sales guy. Let's go.
Yeah, no, I didn't actually take that question from the audience, because I think you all spoke to it really well with that, kind of that shared responsibility model, not in the cloud context, but in the organizational context between the business, IT, security. No one team is going to be solely responsible for SaaS. It's not, no one team is going to have full context of the tooling, the cloud environment, the vendors that are being used. It's definitely going to be a mutual endeavor among the organization. So I think you're spot on. And then Dave, to you to take us out, how do organizations get started on, SaaS governance and security? Any recommendations?
Yeah, definitely. Step one is just understand that, you have this blind spot in your organization. You're probably using SaaS. People are looking at purchasing SaaS. And so coming up with some type of framework, really, just to discover SaaS that's in use, how do you evaluate and manage your SaaS? And then on the final piece is just, how do you secure SaaS? And so coming up with an approach to accomplish that, and just again, just really start off by understanding that you have a security need, and you probably have unmanaged SaaS in your organization that is a security risk, is really where you start.
Yeah, well said. Awesome conversation. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thanks to everyone who tuned in, and look forward to the next session. Thanks all.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys. Have a good day.